Today we're doing a full review of Amazon Originals' Into Shadow collection. The tagline for this collection is "Where the Truth Lies." Some truths are carefully concealed, others are merely forgotten. And let's jump right in by talking about The Garden by Champion-Adeyemi. What's most frustrating to me about this book is it really could have been something, but instead it's very pretentious and shallow. I like that the main character is processing the loss of their mother. They have this journal, they have a destination in mind where their mother left, or maybe where their mother was trying to go and kind of abandon them while she was seeking it, how she's dealing with that grief, how she's relating to her guide, what she has to say about the garden before we get there, and even when we quote-unquote arrive, not doing it for me. I want that growth, transformation, healing kind of moment. You plant yourself in and become something else and it's beautiful, but it's different than what you were before. Or maybe you lay down and die and you become the natural resources that fuel the garden. For a lot of ways this could have gone. A lot of great uses for the garden metaphor here that we really don't fully explore. And the relationship that we start seeing being formed by the main character and the guide is also quite interesting, but it feels like she's just confused and so starved for any kind of emotional contact that she doesn't really understand what she feels for this guide, and this guide is just kind of doing his job. There is an open question when I look at their relationship: how much is the guide doing what he's supposed to be doing for his money versus how much of it is him really inviting her into a relationship with him, whether that's friendship or something more. I think this story is trying to go for a magical realism element, but it does not gel well with the story as it's being told. In a lot of ways, if the garden was an actual real place with no magical properties, it would be better than it being some kind of supernatural magic-ish kind of thing, because then there'd be an actual destination. Maybe we'd physically see a mother's grave, or we'd see this mother search realized in the daughter, and also her and the guide could go into the garden together to achieve this and maybe solidify their relationship. There were opportunities for resolution with these relationships, or to further explore different emotional beats that were not taken and actually were hampered by the fact there's a supernatural element. As a first entry in the Into Shadow collection, this was an incredibly poor start, and it had me very nervous about what to expect going forward. Next is Persephone by Lev Grossman. This is just fine. It's a usual girl has superpowers. They come in during her puberty, teen years. She gets abducted by a government facility and then has to deal with it. There were some nice touches in it that sort of elevate it from very bland to fine but generic. Those include the girl having a father who went missing and her trying to connect with this thing he always said about how her special talent would arise one day with the power that she has now, and the power that she has now is quite destructive and dangerous. There's also this closure about exactly what happened to the father and what that means for this girl going forward. I'd also say the setting here was really grounded and well done. It's set in Lexington, Massachusetts, and as someone who grew up in Massachusetts and has been to Lexington, this felt like the place. This hits to your standard kids coming into their powers, kids puberty metaphor, X-Men kind of thing that you expect from it. Even at 31 pages, it did feel like there were quite a few times where Levman was kind of milking the story. There's a lot of talk in between this girl and this other kid who is also discovered to have powers at the same time. Kind of silly and bantery, and while it's good because it reminds us they're both teens and they're in a weird situation, extra stuff we don't need that doesn't necessarily help us build character or help us give resolution at the end of the story. As far as whether or not Persephone fits into the Into Shadow collection, I would say yes, it does, and it does a much better job than The Garden when it comes to delivering a child parent story. It also does a lot better tackling loss, tackling a relationship that's formed in the middle of discovering all this. Basically, it's a better garden in every shape and form. Moving into The Six Deaths of the Same by Alix Harrow. I love this story. It starts out with second person narration, which always catches my attention, and moves us back and forth between second and first in a way that's very interesting. It uses a ton of like that high fantasy, traditional medieval set dressing that we know all those pieces, expect certain things from them, and then it kind of like twists and morphs it into this really unique and interesting take. I don't want to give anything away. I'm not sure there's a great way to give a summary without doing that, but we've got like a lady being a warrior, we've got a king, we've got a priest, we've got a love interest, we have like the rags to riches theme going on. We have a discussion about like what really is power and what really makes someone's life rich. All of these are done so well. The writing is amazing. I've never read anything from Alix Harrow before, and this definitely put more books on their backlist onto my TBR. Obviously this fits into an Into Shadow collection. There's magic, there's unique storytelling, there's an element of it that's very fairy tale-esque. The whole truth and shadows and lies, it all plays together and speaks to the direct theme of this collection. As far as it being the third in the collection, this is an amazing heel turn from the first two stories. It puts us in a fantasy setting versus our real world with magic elements, and it's good instead of just fine and awful, and it really starts to build excitement for what's going to come further in the collection. What the Dead Know by Nghi. I loved this story. It utilizes some traditional elements of the 1920s spiritualism movement. It weaves the fantasy together with a mystery horror element. I liked how we took the main character, and even though she can speak English and understands perfectly what's going on, she is pretending to actually be from China and therefore unable to speak English or communicate with these people. So it isolates her and makes her incapable of asking for help or expressing what she's seeing or feeling to any of these other characters. It's just like her and this one dude who are playing a con against all these other people, going through this process of discovery and attempting to escape a murderer all on her own. It's tense, it's got great imagery, and I love that it comes after the Six Deaths of the Same, because it's sort of echoing some of these feminist ideas that we started in Six Deaths of the Same. This is another situation where it feels like women are being kept lower than men and trying to achieve goals where women are trying to use this magic for justice or for love or to improve their community as a whole. And I like this as like a fourth story. It sort of grasps these hopeful elements but also signals that we might be taking a darker turn in the collection. Undercover by Tamsyn Muir. I don't really care for where this story is in the collection. Up until this point, every single story has had a very strong sense of place, and Undercover just kind of throws you into something where you're not really sure where you are, why you're there, what's happening, which is fine. Like, I like it, but it's very disorienting after like such strong establishing shots happening in all of the other collection. And of all of the stories I read, Undercover is the one that felt most like homework. Like, I needed to write down all of the details as they were presented and keep connecting them back and seeing what the difference was. Is this normal in the universe, or is this an anomaly within this universe? Which I have no way of knowing because we didn't establish the universe. Always watching these little details, staring very intently at them, trying to make something out of a Rorschach in some ways. There's not a lot I can explain about it without going into spoiler territory, but it is a good fit in the collection as a whole. Arguably, it is the darkest and most shadowed of what we've witnessed thus far in the collection. It does feel significantly more horror than anything else that's come so far, and in fact, I'd say this is a lot closer to like a horror science fiction theme than fantasy. Next is the Candles Are Burning by Veronica G. Henry. I like Veronica G. Henry as an author. To me, this one's not as good as Bacchanalia, but overall a great addition to her body of work. Henry does a really good job creating a sense of place in a historic environment and then weaving the magic into that. I love that we set this someplace specific, like Savannah, Georgia. It's just not randomly in the South. The character work is excellent. We get like a very strong sense of who these people are, and we're really just with this one character for a specific moment in time where she loses her husband and then is sort of trying to find her footing for her and her young daughter in a world without him. And it's through this experience she has losing her husband that kind of like unlocks her ancestral magic, and she has to cope with that at the same time as her figuring out her footing in this world. Unfortunately for me, I felt like the magic was just a little bit underdeveloped. It probably would be better as about a 100-page story versus the 37 we got. There's just like a lot more detail work I feel like could have gone into the magic system here and why things are happening the way they are happening. As far as the Into Shadow collection theme, the Candles Are Burning does a great job with shadows, with lights and darkness, and what it means when you light a candle versus when a candle flows out. All of that was like a lot of fun play with the collection's name. The main conflict here seems to be that our character can see into Death's world and no mortal can. The solution to that problem was pretty creative. I also liked that we got to meet Death, and Death's emotions, thoughts, feelings were somewhat relatable to humanity. I also liked that it kind of felt to me like the story was underpinning how you shouldn't necessarily be afraid of death, and you shouldn't do or not do things because you're afraid that you'll die necessarily. As far as the placement, it's a little bit weird in my opinion. Like, because this is another piece where it's like a historic piece with magic infused, it feels like it should be closer to What the Dead Know and further away from Undercover. And last is going to be Out of the Mirror Darkness by Garth. This was a cool, if anticlimactic story. Personally, I think it is a great close for the collection as a whole. It sort of is more of like an adventure fantasy, kind of fun little romp than speculative. The characters go a long way to making this environment feel real and lived in. Like, it feels like we're just catching people in the middle of their day-to-day life, and this is like a more exciting day than normal. It's another one that does a great job physically playing with the Into Shadow collection title, because light hitting the mirror and covering the mirror in darkness all plays into what's going on in the story and how they can solve a larger problem. And it also talks about like things that were lost in history's time that should stay lost. And now that we're done reviewing each of the books individually, I do want to rearrange the collection and propose a new reading order for you all. First and foremost, don't waste your time with The Garden. Then I go ahead, move Persephone to number 1, fine, and it sort of establishes the fantasy part, how we're grounding most of these stories in the real world, and also how these stories are going to use the fantastic element to cover something like deeper emotionally resonant for us. I'd still follow with The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alix E. Harrow, because it's going to show how experimental fantasy can go and what you can do with very familiar set pieces to do something new and fun. We'll still present What the Dead Know by Nghi next, because I do love how the messaging echoes in these two stories when they're next to each other. But after that, we're going to mix it up by putting The Candles Are Burning by Veronica G. Henry next. This one is a historic period piece the same way Nghi is. Also, Nghi is sort of dealing with death and ghosts on the other side, and so is The Candles Are Burning. So the two of them also pair very well there. And I think there's some interesting comparisons we can do about death and vengeance between these two stories. That'll follow by Out of the Mirror Darkness, because this one is the last of those historical period pieces that still touch the fantasy element. This is like a silver screen era style story. Also, I think like the light reflecting on the mirrors and the candles, those two themes kind of bridge well. And the idea that there's some stuff that should be lost in the annals of history are gonna go well with like the more horror death-themed elements of Undercover, which is going to be the final story. And I like closing with Undercover because it's so drastically different than everything else that's come before it, and that sort of shows the wide range of what we might consider fantasy. Also, it's got like that dark horror theme, and it's got an ending that gives a solid loop to the story, but also you can imagine further adventures for this character. And I feel like thinking about what else is going on in Undercover for a little while is better than Out of the Mirror Darkness, which doesn't leave you with a lot to chew on. And that would be how I'd suggest reading these stories, but overall I would say this is probably one of the better collections in Amazon Originals set. If you have read the Into Shadow series collection, let me know what your favorite book was in those comments down below. And as always, keep reading. Bye!